break, the screaming doppelganger of Beacon Hill, Victoria, British Columbia. Beacon Hill Park in Victoria, British Columbia is famous for its tranquil beauty. But it is also known as the setting for one of the strangest paranormal events ever documented.
In the early 80s, my wife and I used to get up early in the morning and go jogging in the park. Our regular route took us past this rocky area. We saw a woman there. She seemed to be holding her body in some type of yoga position. She was slim, had blonde hair, and she always had on the same clothes every time we saw her. She had a black top and white pants. She was always facing toward the east, toward the rising sun. And she always had her body in the same position. Her feet were apart, and she had her arms stretched high over her head. Her head was always slightly tilted back, and here's the really strange part. Her mouth was wide open as though she were screaming, but of course there wasn't any sound.
The blonde woman was seen by lots of early morning joggers here at beautiful Beacon Hill Park in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. They remarked on her pose and what seemed to be her silent scream. The story we're about to tell you is true. However, we've changed the names of some of the people to protect their real identities. Can you be in two places at once? Watch this and find out.
Back in the early 80s, I used to walk my dog through Beacon Hill Park. I remember seeing the woman standing there. She was always standing the same way. She faced east, her legs apart, her hands above her head and her head back a bit. Her mouth was open as if she were trying to shout. The dog started barking and, you know, I just wanted to check and make sure she was okay. So we went over and asked if she was okay. But it was like she didn't even know we existed. At that point, I felt a little bit bad and kind of silly. It occurred to me that maybe she was doing some sort of a spiritual exercise and I'd interrupted her privacy. So I apologized and we left the park. I saw her a couple of times afterwards, but we just left her alone. And then I was really shocked and confused when I read the stories in the paper.
I worked at Beacon Hill Park from about 1979 when I was a student at university, and I do remember seeing this woman several times. It was only afterwards I realized I never saw her enter the park or leave the rock. I only saw her standing on the rock, always in the early morning and always in the same pose.
We were working at the park as part of the groundskeeping crew. One of the jobs was to walk the park, pick up litter, just make sure the park was clean. So it was November, and there were a lot of leaves, of course. It was a beautiful fall, as usual. We work in teams. We were behind the rock, and there was a lot of leaves all bunched up in this one area. I thought I saw an old shoe, so I went over to clear the leaves and pick up the shoe. That's when I realized there was something wrong.
He called over to me. I had a radio, so we radioed in and got the authorities at the park to call the police. The police came and we showed them the spot. They were there for a long time, and we, of course, had to wait around to answer questions. So we were there when they took out the body. I couldn't believe what I saw. This was the body of a woman, and I knew who she was the moment I saw her. It was the woman I had seen when I worked mornings, the woman standing on the rock. But something struck me as really odd. I later realized that the woman on the rock had blonde hair and tan skin, but the victim was dark hair. She was a brunette and had very pale skin. It was as if the woman on the rock was a negative version of a murder victim.
The autopsy revealed the woman had been strangled before she was buried in a shallow grave behind the rock. Her husband had reported her missing several months earlier, but based on the condition of the body, she had only been dead a short time. Was the murder victim the same woman who had been seen for several years, standing on the rock, just yards from where her body was discovered? And if so, why did she appear in the reverse image of her true self?
This is a phenomenon called a doppelgänger, a German word that means double walker. Traditionally, it was believed that everyone has a shadow or phantom self. and that only the person could see his own doppelganger. But there are many cases that refute this. Cases where family members and others have seen the doppelganger, and a number of stories where whole groups of people have seen the doppelganger and the real person at the same time. Generally, however, the person does not know that his doppelganger is being seen. And this is probably a good thing, because to see a doppelganger is an omen of death. This particular case, the screaming doppelganger at Beacon Hill Park, is interesting for a number of reasons. First, the doppelganger was seen for many years before the woman was murdered, and it was seen by many people. But most interestingly, she was seen as a negative or reverse image of the way she really was in life.
Once the news of this poor woman's murder appeared in the newspapers, many people who had seen her in Beacon Hill Park were shocked and puzzled. But for some, this wasn't the end of the story of the strange woman on the rock.
About 6 weeks after we heard about the murder, my wife and I were out jogging in the park on a regular route when we were stopped dead in our tracks. Up on the rock was the woman again, standing in the same position, her feet apart, arms above her head tilted back, and her mouth open as though she were screaming. And if that isn't enough to stand up the hair on your body, she looked as she did exactly in real life. She had black hair and a pale complexion. She was wearing a white shirt with black pants. And as we stood there, just really stunned, she disappeared.
Her appearances on the rock didn't end when her body was found. She's still seen there from time to time, exactly as she was before, in the same pose. But now it's not the reverse image, it's the way she looked in life. Her murder was never solved. Is this a case of unfinished business?